All right, let's dive into one of history's most epic and tragic conflicts, the Peloponnesian War. We're talking about a brutal 27-year-long struggle that was essentially a Greek civil war. It was a monumental clash between two superpowers that didn't just define an era, it completely shattered the golden age of Greece. So, at the very heart of this war, you've got these two city-states that could not have been more different. On one side, you have Athens, the head of a massive, rich naval empire, a real beacon of democracy and culture. And on the other side, you've got Sparta, this closed-off, militaristic society that commanded the most feared land army in the entire ancient world. Seriously, this was way more than just a battle of armies. It was a battle for the very soul of Greece.
But wait, how did these two, who were once allies, become such bitter enemies? Well, after they teamed up to defeat the massive Persian Empire, a kind of jealous rivalry started to simmer. As Athens started using its alliances money, the Delian League's treasury, to build up its own empire and spread its influence, you can bet the Spartans started watching them with a whole lot of suspicion and fear. So you had this tense peace, but underneath it all, the friction was just waiting to erupt.
Now, to really get a handle on this war, you have to understand these two power blocks. First, there's the Delian League. It started out as a totally voluntary alliance to protect against Persia, but it pretty quickly turned into the Athenian Empire. Member states had to pay tribute to Athens, and Athens used that cash to build up its insane navy and all those magnificent buildings. And Sparta's response? They solidified their own crew, the Peloponnesian League, which was a military coalition pretty much designed for one purpose, to counter Athenian dominance. And this right here, this is just a masterful piece of political spin. Before a single spear was even thrown, Sparta was already winning the propaganda war. They brilliantly positioned themselves not as invaders, but as liberators. You see, a lot of smaller Greek states were getting pretty tired of Athens' bossy attitude, so Sparta's promise to liberate Hellas, that's Greece, it really struck a chord. It framed the whole conflict as a fight for freedom. So, that fragile peace, it finally shattered in 431 BC. Sparta laid down an ultimatum, Athens basically said, no way, and just like that, war was declared. And you know, this wasn't some reluctant march to battle. Oh no, the people in both Athens and Sparta were super enthusiastic, totally gung-ho for this war. Each side was absolutely convinced they were going to get a quick, easy victory. They were about to find out just how devastatingly wrong they were. Their initial game plans were a perfect mirror of their strengths. The great Athenian leader Pericles, he knew they couldn't beat Sparta in a land battle. It was a non-starter. So his plan? Hunker down behind Athens' amazing defensive walls, use their powerhouse navy to raid the Spartan coast, and just import everything they needed by sea. The Spartans, on the other hand, did what they did best. They marched right into Athenian territory year after year, burning farms and wrecking the countryside, trying to bait the Athenians into the big land battle they knew they could win. But Pericles' strategy, as smart as it seemed on paper, it had one huge fatal flaw: packing the city's entire rural population inside the walls, which were already crowded. Well, it created the absolute perfect breeding ground for disease. And just 2 years into the war, an invisible and way more terrifying enemy slipped right through the city's defenses: the Great Athenian Plague. The scale of this devastation is it's hard to even imagine. The plague just ripped through that dense population, killing up to 100,000 people. We're talking nearly a third of everyone crammed inside the walls. And it wasn't just the death toll. Society itself started to fall apart as law and order just collapsed. This was a catastrophic blow that absolutely gutted Athens from the inside out. And so tragically, among the plague's victims was Pericles himself. The architect of Athens' whole grand strategy died in 429 BC. He left the city leaderless at what was probably its most desperate hour. I mean, his loss didn't just weaken the resolve, it kicked off an era of much more aggressive, much more reckless leadership. And that new, reckless leadership, it led straight to what many historians say was the war's biggest turning point. Fueled by this dream of expanding their empire out to the west, the Athenians embarked on a massive, super ambitious, and ultimately disastrous scandal: the Sicilian Expedition. You know, the question on everyone's mind was, could this one campaign finally break the stalemate? The force Athens sent was, by all accounts, the most expensive and impressive expedition they had ever put together. The unspoken goal was to conquer the entire island of Sicily and add its incredible resources to their war machine. It was a massive, high-stakes roll of the dice. But that gamble, it failed spectacularly. The whole campaign was a mess from the very beginning. Divided leadership, confused goals. What was supposed to be a quick, decisive operation got bogged down into this long, bloody siege of the city of Syracuse. And instead of cutting their losses, Athens just kept pouring more and more troops and ships into what was clearly a hopeless cause. The result was just total annihilation. The entire Athenian expeditionary force was completely wiped out. We're talking tens of thousands of their best soldiers and sailors and hundreds of ships, all gone. It was a blow from which the Athenian Empire would never, ever fully recover. This, right here, was the beginning of the end for Athens. So yeah, the defeat in Sicily triggered a seismic shift in the war. A weakened Athens, now stripped of so much of its manpower and its navy, suddenly found itself fighting not for glory but for its own survival against a newly energized Sparta. The final years, as you can see from this timeline, were just a cascade of disasters for Athens. From 413 BC all the way to 404 BC, it was just this desperate struggle to stay alive. Sparta, sensing weakness, just pressed their advantage everywhere, and the once mighty Athenian war machine really began to crumble. So what finally tipped the scales for good? Well, first, Athenian allies started seeing the writing on the wall and began to defect. But the real masterstroke, the real game changer, came from an old enemy, Persia. In this brilliant strategic move, the Persian Empire started funneling gold to Sparta. Why? To finance a brand new fleet that could finally challenge Athens on its home turf, the sea. That money proved absolutely decisive, and it led to the final, total destruction of the Athenian navy. With its navy gone and its food supply cut off, Athens had no choice. It had to surrender. The year was 404 BC, and as part of the peace terms, the city's long defensive walls were torn down, and its empire was completely dismantled. The age of Athenian dominance was officially over. But here's the ultimate tragedy of this whole thing. There were no real winners. Yes, Sparta won the war on paper, but that 27-year struggle had exhausted and bankrupted pretty much all of Greece. It shattered alliances, it decimated populations, and it brought a final end to that incredible golden age, creating this massive power vacuum across the entire region. And that leaves us with one last crucial question. With the great powers of Athens and Sparta basically broken by decades of fighting each other, the Greek world was left incredibly vulnerable. And they totally failed to see the growing threat to their north, in a kingdom called Macedonia, which was just waiting, poised to exploit their weakness and change the course of history forever.